Yeah, so thank you so much for coming. Happy opening day for all those who celebrate. My Tigers are up 4-0 early in the first inning. So things are starting off well. My name is Ilyana Kuzhenko. I've met many of you before, but for those who don't know me, I'm a professor of economics here at Princeton and the co-director of the Griswold Center on Economic Policy Studies. So on behalf of the Griswold Center and the James Madison Program, we're really excited to bring you this joint event, a book talk with Chris Griswold, one of the authors of The New Conservatives, Restoring America's Commitment to Family, Community, and Industry. So I think this is a really interesting moment, and there's certainly more than at any time I can remember in my adult life, a real interest among people on sort of more the GOP Republican side to talk about work and economic inequality and the rights of workers. And so Chris is going to be, I think, a really perfect guest to have to talk about this growing intellectual movement. So Chris is the policy director at American Compass. He was previously the senior advisor to Marco Rubio, a man who is quite busy these days. Chris is a non-resident fellow at the Research Institute of Economy, Trade, and Industry in Tokyo, and has held fellowships at the Council of Foreign Relations and Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. And prior to his Washington career, Chris helped launch and scale a nationwide youth development nonprofit in South Africa. Chris received his BA from Wheaton College and is returning to Princeton after having finished his Master of Divinity from the Princeton Theological Seminary, and we're thrilled to welcome him back to campus today. So Chris, the floor is yours. I know you have some prepared remarks. I'll start with some questions and then we'll open it up to the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here at the delightfully and tastefully named Griswold Center.
Oh, I should have said no relation as far as we know.
As far as we know. And I am thrilled to be here. Thank you for being here on a sunny day. We were talking earlier about whether any students would show up given the sun, and I would be on their side if they didn't. So I appreciate you all being here on such a beautiful day. I am in the unusual and delightful position of talking about a book, almost none of which I wrote. This is a collection of 30 essays, of which one is mine, and there are a few benefits to being in this position. The first and most important benefit is that if you ask me any tough questions, I can refer them to someone else. And the other is that it allows me to step back a little bit from just cataloging the contents of the book and talk about why the book exists, what it means that it exists, at a bit of a higher level. So I want to do that. And then I do want to take a few minutes as the kind of prerogative of the contributing author who happens to be here to give you a substantive argument to sink your teeth into, to engage with, to agree with or disagree with on how I view the state of American economics and how I think about it. So the book is a collection of pieces that have been previously published by and at American Compass, which is the think tank I work for. Pieces by Orrin Cass, who's our founder and chief economist, Julius Krein, who is the editor of American Affairs, Yuval Levin at the American Enterprise Institute, Michael Lind, the economic historian, a bunch of people formerly on our team that are now elsewhere, like at the Domestic Policy Council and at USTR's office and elsewhere. One piece is by Marco Rubio, when he had time to do such things. And they cover a range of topics, from the nature of the market, the nature of the state, labor and capital, to specific policy areas like globalization, China, industrial policy, worker power, education, family, budget. That's the content. But the what and the why is that together they offer what we hope is a representative sample of the shifts in economic thinking that have been happening on the right of center over the last few years, shifts that it is the purpose of American Compass to effectuate. Our mission is to restore, I'm quoting from our mission statement now in case my boss is watching. Our mission is to restore an economic consensus that emphasizes the importance of family, community, and liberty to the family, community, and industry to the nation's liberty and prosperity, which is just a mission statement-y way of saying that the neoliberal Washington consensus is wrong. Unfortunately, it is wrong but not dead, and it needs to be replaced by something else. I think in terms of a bit of history, our theory of the case of how we got here, the conservative coalition that advanced for its part, the kind of GOP half of that Washington consensus, that coalition has long lived past its sell-by date. It's past the point of positive returns. Starting in at least the 1980s, we observed in the U.S. what we all call fusionism, which is the supposed three-legged stool of the modern American conservative movement, of social conservatives, economic libertarians, and defense hawks, who got together in the 80s because they all shared in common a hatred of communism and a desire to win the Cold War, which they did. But it turned out, after they won the Cold War, that there is not actually any inherent reason why those three types of people or thinkers should live together in the same coalition. And what I would say started to happen is that the economic libertarianism, and it's worth noting that during that kind of Cold War period, the GOP was actually much more realist. Reagan raised taxes 5 times. George H.W. quite famously raised taxes. And it was only after the Cold War that we started to ossify into this idea that tax cuts are always a good idea and always pay for themselves in this kind of dogmatic sense. Same thing on trade. When Ronald Reagan left office, the Cato Institute famously decried him as like good riddance to the worst protectionist since Herbert Hoover, because he was very realist on trade as well. But after we won the Cold War, we started to ossify into this idea that free trade is always and everywhere good, and you should just hit the gas pedal on it. Never mind if the trading partner in question is a massive economy with the stated purpose of global industrial dominance and an interest in taking our critical industries. And so you see this shift from this kind of coalition of convenience or coalition of purpose that actually did seem to get the job done to what I would call a kind of market fundamentalism. And I use the term fundamentalism advisedly, not as a pejorative sense, but as a descriptive sense of what fundamentalism actually is, which is an ossified, rigid commitment to a perverted, version of your source documents. This is not, in fact, what Adam Smith was trying to teach us. And so what we have then, starting in this period and going till now, is American industry hollowed out, financial sector exploding and cannibalizing its own capital base through making its money through financial engineering rather than actual investment. Inequality skyrocketing, supply chains turned brittle and exploitable. Manufacturing productivity going down. We're getting actively worse at making things and shipping off our own innovative capacity along with our own industrial capacity. Wages stagnant, even as corporate profits balloon. The labor movement effectively dead. 6% of private sector workers are union members. And eventually, in the context of this fallout of a libertarian fundamentalism, it occurred to enough people that these legs of the three-legged stool don't actually have to live together, that libertarian and conservative are not synonymous. And in fact, when it comes to these questions, they might be mutually exclusive, because it sure seems like that kind of fundamentalism did not work out all that well for working Americans and for the things that conservatives say they care about, like not just working people, but strong and healthy families, thriving local communities, vital national industry, and a healthy, strong nation, none of which have been well served by this neoliberal Washington consensus. And for what it's worth, the fathers of libertarian thinking would probably agree. Hayek very famously wrote an essay called Why I Am Not a Conservative. These are not synonymous, even if they were treated as coalitionally synonymous for purposes of the Cold War. And so our purpose at American Compass, we were founded 5 years ago to try and put together a body of thought and a policy agenda to offer something better than that for workers and families and industry and the nation. And we've had some success at that. And that is what you see in the book that hopefully you'll all buy outside. A generation of thinkers and leaders who have rejected the old orthodoxy and are in search of something different. And I think it's especially worth noting how prevalent this rejection of economic orthodoxy is among younger conservatives. We've done a bunch of polling on this, so have other people. If you are a conservative under 40, your formative, if you're anyone under 40 in America, your formative political experiences were not, your first political memories were not the triumph of American capitalism and winning the Cold War and this triumphalist experience of American hegemony. It was 9/11 followed by forever wars in which you or people you know served and potentially didn't come back. It was the financial crisis in which the failures of this version of capitalism were on perfectly clear display for you just as you were trying to get a job. And so it should surprise no one that there is an interest, especially among younger thinkers and leaders and in the conservative space, in something a bit more skeptical of free trade and tax cuts at any price, a bit more open to antitrust enforcement and organized voice and power for workers in the workplace. And that is what we're seeing. And you see that in people like some of the folks that are working with labor unions in the Senate to advance little pieces of the Democratic Party PRO Act, like Josh Hawley and the Teamsters Union at the moment. You see it in the growth of conservative antitrust. We just hired at American Compass Gail Slater, the recently departed head of DOJ's antitrust division, who was trying to turn the corner on something a little less deferential to big businesses' desire to merge all the time. And I mean that is what we have been up to. You see it in the interest of some of the folks in the administration in rethinking trade orthodoxy, certainly, which I'm sure there will be questions about. We could talk about that, and so on. So that is why the book exists and what it is. By way of overview, speaking for all the authors, give you an orientation of why we're here. That having been said, pause. Offer you my own thoughts of what I think, how I think about these questions that I would love your criticisms and critiques of. Is that the fundamental question for me is teleological when it comes to economics. Aristotle, as in so many other instances, guides us well on this question when he teaches us that the good of a thing is found in its function, meaning you can't know if something is working well unless you know what it's for. And if I had to distill in one sentence what I think all of these shifts in economic thinking on the right are about, they are about a willingness to ask the question, what is the economy for? It's about subjecting economics to a teleological analysis of ends and purposes, not just means, and a rejection of the conflation of ends and means, which is one way I would describe the neoliberal consensus, that growth for its own sake is in fact the best thing you can do for society, and therefore getting out of the market's way is both good economics and good for people. I reject that, and I think the new thinking on the right does as well. But if you ask that question, that obligates you then to offer a normative answer. If you can no longer conflate means and ends, and that you no longer have that get out of jail free card, then you have to answer the question, what is the economy for? My favorite source quote to answer that question comes from Pope Benedict XVI, one of the more overlooked modern popes, who said the following: "The economy and finance do not exist for their own sake. They are only an instrument or a means. Their sole end is the human person and his or her total fulfillment in dignity. This is the only capital that it is right to safeguard." And so my answer to the question of what is the economy for, economy is for providing for and protecting the material preconditions of human flourishing, because human beings have dignity. And that means we have to treat them a certain set of ways. And when applied then to economics, specifically, it begs a second question, which is, what is capitalism for? If the reason we are doing capitalism in the United States rather than something else is because we think it's the best way to provide for and protect the material preconditions of human flourishing, well, why do we think that? And what has gone wrong? Because this version of capitalism is clearly not doing that in any manner of important respects. And I would offer just three thoughts, I think, that for me follow. One of which is that healthy capitalism, one, respects and supports the non-market institutions that enrich and undergird human thriving, like the family, like local community, and shared spaces, like civic institutions, like the educational system. Two, it is willing to distinguish between productive and unproductive activity, and has an interest in channeling capital to productive activity rather than unproductive activity. And that, too, is a willingness to make normative claims that economic orthodoxy is uncomfortable with. But I think it's incredibly important to recognize that the Capitalism 101 that we were all taught in high school sounds something like the corporate sector borrows money from financial markets, invests it in something useful and productive. Because it's useful and productive, it makes money, some of which you return to shareholders and some of which you reinvest in continuing to do useful and productive things. That is, in fact, not an accurate description of the state of American capitalism, in which, I mean, the non-financial corporate sector is a net lender for that's crazy, where we did a bunch of analysis on what we called sustainers and eroders. As a corporation, are you making enough money to cover your costs, and then, like, what are you doing with it? And the shift, if you just look at the trend lines between those corporations, which say in the 70s, majority would return some to shareholders, but have enough to reinvest. We have averaged, in some of the recent years, over 100% of profits returned to shareholders. If you look at a 10-year period, I'm going to misremember my numbers, I think from 2015 to 2025, I think, is about an average of 100% each year of return to shareholders. American corporate sector is eroding its own capital base for quicker, smoother profits in financial markets. So yes, I think two, that second point is that healthy capitalism distinguishes between productive and unproductive activity. And three, and this gets, I think, to the very heart of the matter and is also, I think, at the heart of our political discontent and what we might call the crisis of American democracy, is that healthy capitalism, premised on the dignity of the human person and organized in the interests of protecting human flourishing, recognizes that to be itself durable and acceptable, it cannot treat workers as factors of production. It has to treat them as human persons and therefore as co-creators of economic value, which, among other things, requires that those workers have real voice and power in the workplace, that they have a genuine sense of agency in their economic life, which, as everyone from Aristotle to Martin Luther King teaches us, is a precondition of civic democracy as well. If you don't have a sense of agency and voice in economic life, which, by the way, is the space in which we most frequently encounter one another and teaches us what our society thinks about us, civic democracy is not going to work all that well in its absence. So that's my theory of the case, is if you are willing to make normative judgments about the teleology in economics, what it's for, and premise that in a definitive view of the human person as possessed of infinite dignity, it requires that you grapple with these questions in a way that neoliberal orthodoxy does not require you to do. If you are thinking in those orthodox terms, you can get away with saying, well, actually, hands-off is what's best for human dignity, and I don't have to think beyond that. That hasn't worked. And the trend lines on the right are, I think, clearly showing that there's a growing rejection of that line of thinking. Now, before I shut up and we have a conversation with each other, which is the actual fun part of today, a word about Trump, because if I was sitting where you're sitting, it would be easy to say, okay, that all sounds great. I'm not 100% sure that maps on to what I'm seeing the Trump administration do, to which I would say, yeah, that's right. I view Trump as a transitional figure. I think it's legitimate to say that demolition is a valid part of the rebuilding process, but you do need to move past demolition eventually, which the president does not seem dispositionally inclined to do. And I think the question for me and for us is a longer-term question. I mean, it took 30 years between Buckley starting National Review and Ronald Reagan getting elected, which represented the apotheosis of his view of what conservatism should be. This is a longer-term game. What happens after Trump is the real question. There are elements in fairness, elements of what Trump is doing that I think are important. I think his trade agenda gets a bit of a bad rap, legitimate criticisms notwithstanding. But what happens next is the real ball game. And so if you do read this book or peruse it or pick the essays that are of interest to you and take a look at it, I would encourage you to read them with that in mind. This is the foundation of a growing intellectual movement in American conservatism that wants to build for the long term something healthier on American economics. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for starting us off and for your contribution to the book. I think I will start with the same question that I asked Osita Winevu, who came last month and gave a book talk on his, the right of the people. And there's a lot of overlap, especially when we talk about workers. And so he has a very social democratic agenda for workers. There's much overlap with, unions and worker voice, minimum wages, treating workers not, as as something to cost minimize. And so the question I asked him, do we think there's an appetite for that in America in a world in which all we talk about is affordability? And we say, things need to be cheaper. I think Americans mostly view themselves as consumers and not workers. And in this, in this affordability crisis, as we talk about, is there really an agenda for potentially making things more expensive because we're allowing workers to have higher wages and more say on the job?
Well, that's a great question. It's a good thing I'm not running for anything because I can say bad things about the affordability agenda, right? I think it is at the heart of this analysis that the consumer welfare principle, meaning that low prices for consumers are the metric for economic well-being, is wrong. It's wrong. And it's wrong on quite a deep level because it does conceptualize human persons as consumers rather than as producers and generators of economic value. And I think all you have to do is look at like the social and psychological effects of, say, for example, you have a job that makes you feel like a valued contributor to your society because you are, and you're doing something productive that pays you $50,000 a year and offers you some reasonable benefits and predictable hours and the apparatus around which you can build a dignified life with your family and have a family in the place you live, versus a redistribution from taxpayer money in the same amount. Economically, there's not any difference between, the check is the same dollar figure.
No, economically,
right?
I prefer the leisure.
Right, exactly. And that is not I think a terribly constructive way to conceptualize like the healthy society. Exactly, because if economic models tell us that actually what we're all seeking is like, I'd love to make a ton of money and do no work, that's not what human thriving actually looks like. George Orwell, of all people, was very insightful on this. He was himself a socialist struggling with the deficits of his own political community. And he talked about this, about how much of a nightmare, and he was, I think, quite accurately forecasting into kind of the UBI conversations that we have, how much of a nightmare a workless post-work society would be, in which we all give ourselves over to our kind of baser impulses, which is in fact what's happening. So if you see work disappear for, say, for example, American men without a college degree, you have a very real crisis of people sitting in their basements, wasting their savings on financial, prediction markets, playing video games and watching porn. And I'm not saying this disparagingly. I'm saying that I understand. I get it. If I couldn't find a good job, what else would I mean, that's human nature, right? And so, yeah, I think it's fundamental to how we think of a healthy society that people have access to dignified work. It's not the same as being able to consume in like the same dollar amount at all. And I think it's worth saying that the neoliberal consensus hasn't made working people better off, even on that level, right? Our flat screen TVs got cheaper. But if you look at, some of the analysis we've done about just the cost of a middle class lifestyle, it's gotten harder to afford, not less. Like this consumer driven orthodoxy hasn't worked out all that well, even on its own terms, in my opinion. So, does that answer your question, though? Do you want to?
I think you rejected the premise of my question.
Yes, it's always the most fun way to deal with the question.
So I guess one question is, what separates a social democrat like Bernie Sanders from the authors in this book? I don't think many of the authors in this book supported Bernie in 2016 or 2020. I mean, there could be exceptions that I don't know about. And I suspect the reason would be that they disagree on other social issues. I mean, I think on the economic agenda, Bernie would probably agree with almost everything you just said. Workers should be treated with dignity. Trade is something that needs to be regulated. Bernie would even probably say, has said in the past that immigration needs to be regulated. But are the social issues, Bernie supports, abortion rights as an example, are those too much to overcome? Or, do you see partnership with somebody like a Bernie or an AOC because the economic overlap is strong enough?
Now on this one, I both agree and disagree with the premise of the question. But so on the one hand, sure, of course there's common ground. You see Josh Hawley and Bernie working on bills all the time, as Vance and Warren did, and as Rubio and Sherrod Brown did, and so on, because of this growing shared interest in a new kind of economics. My favorite example of this, I made brief reference to this earlier, my favorite example of this is in labor reform, where the Democratic Party has long had the PRO Act, which is a laundry list of what labor would like. Some of those are either bad ideas on the merits or just politically dead on arrival anyway, which is why even when the Democrats have controlled both chambers of Congress and the White House, they haven't been able to pass it. But some of those ideas are good. And what Josh Hawley decided to do is just start cutting and pasting the good bits of it that he thinks are justifiable on the merits and could garner bipartisan support, introducing those pieces as their own bills with other Republicans and Democrats, like Bernie Moreno from Ohio as a Republican, and Cory Booker and others from the Democratic Party, doing so in cooperation with the Teamsters Union, which also then puts labor in the spot of having to make a decision. And that
Teamsters have always been a bit of a renegade union,
they
for
are
sure.
market leaders, I would say,
Yes.
in this respect. But just the first plank of that, which is about expediting first contracts after you manage to get a union vote, which is hard enough, that is living rent-free in the business community's head in a way that the much more expansive and exhaustive PRO Act never did, because no one ever thought that was a viable, real thing, because it wasn't. This might be.
But it hasn't passed, right?
No, but it's, the relevant Senate committee has a one-seat majority. I think it's actually even split now that Mark Wayne Mullen is the Secretary at Homeland Security. And Hawley has made them have hearings on it with labor, presidents as the Republican witnesses. These things always take a long time to pass. What's interesting to me is that from the perspective of business lobbyists on K Street, this is way more movement than they ever expected to see on something like this, and they're really worried about it.
No, I mean,
So-
just as way of background, I mean, it used to be relatively straightforward after winning organizing election that you would get your first contract, that the employers would bargain in good faith. I believe we are down to 30% of union victories leading to a contract within 12 months. Which, of all the Starbucks organizing, I believe they have 0 contracts.
I mean, something similar happened in some of the quite remarkable victories at Amazon, right? Where and this is what this specific bill is meant to address, is to disallow that maneuver on the part of employers, right? Which is a good idea. We should do that. And there is growing consensus on that question. And I use that just as an example of, yes, there is absolutely, and there are other examples as well, of practical cooperation around a shared diagnosis. I mean, some of your own academic research, right, shows us when union density is higher, inequality goes down, right? That's just true, and I think a growing number of Republicans are appreciating that. So yes, encouraging signs on the one hand, and I think under the hood, even in ways that, like, if you lift up the hood of the car and look at the inner workings, a lot more young conservatives in Washington would secretly say, yeah, Bernie's kind of awesome, than would say so publicly.
But sort of getting back to the challenge of my question, do you think that, like, for a Josh Hawley or for, your compatriots, that the social issues would be a major hurdle?
Yeah.
And
so that's the second half of the semicolon sentence, I guess. Of course, that's a major point of difference, and it is certainly possible to work on economics across those differences. Where that becomes more relevant to me, in my mind, is in electoral politics, and that part of the problem that the Democratic Party has is that it is number one, I think, in the most recent election, did not embrace the opportunity to kind of be fully economically populist. That's not how I read the Harris campaign. I think that was a mistake. But there is also, I think, some of the savvier Democrats, including some that we work with, an impulse to think that you can economically populist your way out of the fact that the majority of working people don't agree with you on important cultural issues. And the merits of those views aside, that's just a political reality that the Democrats are going to have to figure out how to deal with. I think the challenge on the Republican side is whether getting durably and consistently economically populist is in fact possible, because currently at the moment it's a mixed bag. I think we are winning the intellectual fight. That doesn't mean we've won the majority of the policy fights so far, and I think that's fair to say. So, I mean, Chris Murphy, a Democrat of Connecticut, I think, is really thoughtful on these questions. I encourage you to read some of his work from a few years ago. There's an Atlantic essay called "The Wreckage of Neoliberalism," I think it's called, in which he encourages Democrats to recognize that the failure of neoliberalism is spiritual, which is just not how Democratic elected officials talk. It's spiritual, it's communal, it has to do with family, and Democrats need to figure out how to talk about that. And his opinion, and I think in general he's probably right, is that the political race is between whether Democrats can widen the tent first, or whether Republicans can get consistently economically populist first, and maybe de-radicalize their fringe. Whoever cracks that code first is king for 100 years, I think. So that's kind of quick and dirty analysis, but I think as an electoral matter, of course these questions matter. And I think also, and stop me if I'm talking too long, but the question implied by your question is, how are you guys not just progressives, in a sense, right? And one of the answers to that question, I think, and the way I would disagree with Bernie in some instances, is a respect, ironically, after everything you just heard me say, for the free market and for the proper functioning of the free market. There are things that only the market can do. Healthy capitalism pushes the market to do those things. It just constrains the market in such a way that the things it's optimizing for redound to human flourishing and the national interest, which is not guaranteed. And that's the failure of libertarianism, is to think that it is guaranteed. It's not. But that doesn't mean that you want highly intrusive government programs trying to engineer all this either. And I do think even in those places where there's a similar diagnosis, big picture diagnosis, Some folks on the left are overly eager for a kind of state-heavy set of solutions when that's not actually what you need to do. What you need to do is put constraints around the market so that it does a different set of things. So, sorry.
I will open it up with the prerogative of the organizer to take the microphone back if I want to ask another question. And Dana will come around with the microphone just so that everybody can hear you.
Thank you. Very interesting. Is it on?
I think so.
You said something about 100% of profits. You said 100% of profits are, I guess, going to investors or shareholders. I'm having trouble wrapping my head around that, having spent 40 years in business. Is it an accounting thing, how you're defining profit, or can you go deeper on that? Because I'm not buying it.
Yeah, well, I like I said, I made the ill-advised choice to quote a stat that I can't remember the source of. So let's, one, bracket that, and I'll happy to email you and actually answer the substance of your question, remind myself what accounting that stat was using. I think the deeper point that I was trying to make, which I think is true, is a shift from reinvestment to the disgorging of profits to shareholders through dividends and especially stock buybacks. I mean, after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was premised on the idea that further tax cuts would incent business investment, what we actually got wasn't much business investment at all. It was $1 trillion in stock buybacks, which to me calls into question, like, if that is actually true, if what the American business community is telling us is that it has no creative use for $1 trillion, that calls into question the viability of the capitalist enterprise. And I don't think it's true that they don't have better use for $1 trillion. I think it's true that they are under enormous pressure to deliver smooth quarterly returns, and that the CEO that tried to use too much of that to make risky, long-term, expensive capital investments and make those bets would get fired by the board if the board tried it, to get replaced by the institutional shareholders that they represent. And that seems to me, in fact, a feature of how American capitalism is currently working, is this shift away from investment, actual investment, to financial engineering and a focus on circulating assets. So I don't know if that answers your question satisfactorily, but that's the point I was trying to get at, is that the function of the financial markets are to help channel capital to productive use. And I don't see that happening at the level at which it needs to for American society to be healthy.
Well, I'd just come back and say the recent phenomenon of investments in AI in corporate America, isn't that a reinvestment?
It is, and you see the stats kind of spiking on, like, I mean, you saw it first through the CHIPS and Science Act, where the charts are unbelievable. Well, all of a sudden we did see this huge spike, and that was a function of policy. And AI is a kind of special case, maybe in all kinds of ways, and whether or not that's a bubble is a whole different conversation. I find the CHIPS Act phenomenon an even more instructive one, where we invented semiconductors. We lost semiconductors to those nations that decided they were going to make it a policy priority to be the world leaders in making them. We let that happen. And if we wanted one back, it was going to take policy to do. I think it was an incredible achievement by President Biden and, frankly, members of Congress of both parties to make that happen. And it's working. Valid criticisms about some of the implementation aside, it is in fact working, and we're on track to have a semiconductor industry again. And yeah, you see the spike of actual investment. I mean, one of my favorite stats is that after just TSMC alone, if you annualize like over 10, it's 10-year commitment, if you just annualize that out, by itself, like doubles the amount of greenfield FDI in the U.S. relative to what happened in the few years after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That's how little actual greenfield foreign direct investment is. Almost all foreign direct investment is just acquisitions. It's just asset swaps. It's not actually, and that I think is a feature of this newer wave of economic thinking, is that like the word investment is being used to mean more than one thing, and they're not the same, and they don't have the same relevance to national health. Well, we should welcome greenfield FDI, but that's not really what's happening. It's acquisitions.
What do you think about sort of the parallel of Japanese cars and how Reagan said, yeah, you can come in, but you have to invest here?
We've written about that. Yeah, it might actually be in the book.
It is.
Yes.
But should we apply that parallel to Chinese EVs,
No.
BYD?
No.
Okay, why
China,
not?
I think, is a special case. We, in fact, just sent a letter to the president on this topic because of his public comments that he seems like he might be inclined to put Chinese FDI on the table if and when he ever does end up meeting with Xi Jinping. No, I think China is a special case because in that instance, the CCP state-controlled economy in which private actors, allegedly private actors, are subject to the geopolitical priorities of the CCP and will be supported and or punished by the CCP to achieve those geopolitical ends, is not a compatible economic system with the democratic free market that we have. And we learned that the hard way in the reverse after 2000 when we granted China permanent normal trade relations, not only lost like 3 million manufacturing jobs in 3 years immediately, and hollowed out our industrial capacity, but we learned that American investment there was welcome for only as long as it took Chinese companies to acquire and indigenize the IP, and then kicked them. Tesla learned this, started to kick them all back out.
I mean, in this case, we'd be taking their IP, right?
Well, right.
I mean,
And
they're way ahead of us.
Well, and I think that's tempting to think about it. Like, well, why can't we run their playbook on them? Number one, they know their playbook. I think they're smarter than that. And seems to me implausible that a Chinese company operating in the U.S. will be any less subject to the dictates of the CCP, could still be supported financially by the government, could still be subject to its political priorities. There's nothing at all stopping an automaker from undercutting American automakers and then leaving. There's nothing at all to say that. And we don't have the kind of government apparatus, nor should we, I think, to force GM to steal BYD's tech, right? That's just not going to happen. So I think it's not like the direction of the flow that makes it different. I think it's the same. It's the nature of the two economies that's relevant, and they're incompatible regardless of which way the ship is sailing.
I mean, do we worry that actually some of the malaise of neoliberal, people getting tired of neoliberalism, is that they look to China and see more vibrancy? So it's not, it's not so much the inequality it's produced, but that it actually, the neoliberal era growth has been a lot slower than it had been in the decades right after World War II. We see this other model that seems more vibrant and certainly, in some ways more innovative in certain sectors, certainly. I get the sense that a lot of elites, like you just heard Jamie Dimon say, reluctantly, we need to do industrial policy because competition isn't cutting it. I kind of wonder how much you worry that actually speaking ill of our sort of current capitalism, current neoliberal regime actually pushes people toward thinking, oh, well, China has the answer.
Well,
I think a lot of elites are thinking that.
I hear you. And it is also a favorite attack line from the Wall Street Journal editorial board and Nikki Haley and all of the traditional economic conservatives that hate the work we're doing to say, well, we shouldn't become like China to be China. Why are you trying to socialize the economy and do top-down industrial planning or whatever? Which one I think is a totally unfair and inaccurate description of what we're actually advocating for. The CHIPS Act is not Soviet-style central planning. It worked pretty well. So I think that's an unfair comparison. But no, I mean, China has its own problems, right? I think there's a danger in romanticizing the Chinese model too much. And they are going to have an even bigger problem if we succeed in denying them the opportunity to keep shipping their excess production here. We are the absorber of last resort.
Much less, though, right, than before.
Well, right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so because of tariffs, and so a lot of that is shifting elsewhere. And now Europe is confronted with exactly the same crisis of like, well, are we going to let all these goods come into the U.S., I mean, to Europe and undercut our industrial base like happened in the U.S.? And I do worry the EU is at risk of making the wrong set of decisions on that question, which, by the way, is another reason why President Trump should not put this on the table negotiating to. It's going to be really hard to keep pressing our trading partners to be tough on China. If we're not, then the whole logic of that falls apart and gets undermined. But yeah, so no, I don't think we should romanticize China. I do think we should acknowledge that they have outplayed us badly for a decade or two now, and we should not permit that to continue and do what we need to reclaim some industrial strength and some techno-industrial strength.
All right, let me open it back up to, we have quite a few hands.
Yeah, I had a question. Thank you. I'm kind of a bipartisan moderate, but I wonder if you thought this guy Mandami, like, you work hard to like pay your house off debt free. He wants to do like shared equity now out of your house, and it's grown popular among people. Like Mandami's obviously becoming like a Bernie, and New York's a major state. What do you think of that? How do you work with people like this? I mean, how do you? This is reality.
I think there is a reason why, in the wake of the 2024 shellacking that the Democrats received, there's a reason why I think New York City is now the spiritual center of the post-neoliberal left. Because, number one, there isn't any real leadership on offer, high-level elected leadership that's working. And I think he has mastered the art of making people feel legitimately heard and respected. That's good politics and, frankly, good leadership. I also find it notable that a lot of his base is less New York City's working class and more the anxious, downwardly mobile professional class. I think that's an under-discussed phenomenon that's only going to get more important in the wake of AI, which is coming for, white-collar professions first, as opposed to globalization, which came for blue-collar jobs first, where there's a deep anxiety kind of among this professional class that was sold a bill of goods. They go to college, take on all this debt, and didn't get the life that they thought they were promised. I think he's speaking to that anxiety with political effectiveness. I have all kinds of critiques of the policy particulars. I would charge $1 for a bus ride rather than making it free, and I'm not sure a rent freeze is going to actually solve the legitimate cost of housing problem. But I appreciate the skill with which he has re-energized the post-neoliberal left and given it some energy to work with. I mean, just today or yesterday, our team was discussing his announcement that he's coming for waste in government programs, which is a genius thing to do and is a way of signaling that he himself is not kind of just standard issue, predictable, stereotypically left, but he's open to good ideas, including maybe not wasting the taxpayer money on, failed programs. It's just politically genius. So, and it's funny to see the weird degree to which Trump and Mamdani seem to like each other. So, yeah.
Two outer borough guys.
Exactly, and both outsiders that I think were looked down on by the establishment and won anyway. So there's a weird mutual respect there.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for the talk. Very interesting. You already kind of answered my first question. I have two, but maybe you can still say some more on it. So the first question I have is on your solutions that you propose, and I would like to know more exactly where you would draw the difference between you and Bernie, and maybe what you said that you don't want a highly intrusive government. Like, where would be the line for you? I get the stronger unions, regulating trade, but how about like wealth tax? Would you go like Piketty style? Would you also tax windfall profits from the new energy price shock? Would you favor a job guarantee? How do you think about macroprudential regulation? Like, do you think these are all areas where you agree with the left or not? And my second question is on implementation. So what do you think, how realistic or how would you tackle this practically like implementing these things against the really powerful vested interests that are surely not liking what you're proposing, and that have also arguably be kind of against Bernie as a candidate on the Democratic side. So I guess like this applies to both the GOP and the Democrats. Like, what do you think is a realistic way for implementing these things in practice?
Yeah, no, there's a lot to your question. I guess I understand the first part of your question to just be, can you talk about what our policy agenda is a bit more concretely? So if I were to break out into two buckets, the philosophical kind of reflections I was offering earlier, it would be that one, markets should be productive, and two, that communities need to be supportive, which just means that they need the institutions that undergird healthy communities need to be supported. And if you take that second bucket first, let's talk about family, labor, and education, for example. We support a cash monthly benefit to families, working families with children. I've had a lot of success in advancing that idea on the right. One of the more satisfying moments of the recent think tank fights in DC was when the Heritage Foundation finally came around to admit that we were right the whole time, and actually we do need a super generous child benefit to make families affordable to have and raise. Economic pressure should not be the reason why someone who wants to have and raise a family doesn't. So that's one specific. Under the family bucket as well, we do a lot on social media and now AI and protecting children from the clearly demonstrable harms that those products visit on children, which I think is an interesting case study in how commonsensical the public finds the idea that the market shouldn't be deciding everything. We don't do that with child safety on anything. We don't let kids buy guns. We don't let them buy tobacco and alcohol. We don't let them drive until they're a certain age, and we probably shouldn't let them on Instagram until they're a certain age as well. The vast majority of parents of all political persuasions believe that. So we work on that. Under the education bucket, I think the top line idea there is that we need to seriously invest in dignified non-college pathways that afford people a path to decent jobs with some social respect and good wages. We are insanely over-indexed on the higher education system. With full respect for where I'm sitting, I mean we've done. Yeah, well, the endowment, working on the endowment tax, so we're coming. Don't worry.
All right, you can leave now.
But I mean, we've done the numbers, and fewer than 1 in 5 American students go smoothly from like graduating high school on time into a 4-year degree, graduating that on time, and then going into a job that required a degree in the first place. Fewer than 1 in 5 travel that trajectory, and yet our whole system is designed around the premise that that's what everyone should do. It's just not working. It's broken. It's also, of course, a source of polarization as well. And so we've got proposals for per high school, grants that follow a high school grad that help offset the cost of quality on the job training, and just pull employers into this discussion in a healthier way. I mean, they're the ones who know what skills they need. They're the ones who are doing the hiring anyway. Why aren't we tasking them with some of this workforce development obligation? So we've done that, and we've got thoughts on higher education as well, but I'll save those. And then on labor, workers need voice and power in the workplace, and we work on 2 levels on that. One is making the current system work better, and that's the Hawley Teamsters kind of example of making the current National Labor Relations Act system more effective because it's not working on its own terms. But then also thinking bigger about better models than the enterprise level, like unionized workplace by workplace system. I mean, sectoral bargaining, something I've written a lot about, and I think we should absolutely be doing the bargaining at the industry and or regional level. And that elevates those power plays out of the workplace, leaves a whole lot more room for collaborative interaction between labor and management, while the hard edge negotiation happens elsewhere. I think that makes sense. And incidentally, would allow us, there'd be a bit less need for one-size-fits-all federal regulations, which I think a lot of traditional conservatives should like sectoral bargaining as well. The Ghent system in Europe works really well, where you let worker-controlled organizations administer worker benefits rather than the state or employers doing it, which is what we do here. Uptake on benefits you're eligible for is much higher. Transparency and accountability is much higher because the people administering it are accountable to the voting members rather than a bureaucrat that is accountable to no one in a state government running your UI system or whatever, your unemployment insurance system. It's just a better model, and we've polled on this, and it would be an unbelievable slam dunk popular idea to make that more legally viable in the U.S. So that's just the community side. We can talk about productive markets as well, and industrial policy, trade policy, and so on. But I'll stop there because I think I've given you at least partly an example.
I think there's been interesting, I think in Minnesota, there's some interesting reforms on sectoral wage
Yes.
setting. And, I think a lot of people in the labor movement, as much as we're used to the NLRA, Wagner-style organizing, feel like it has, it's past its sell date.
Mm-hmm.
And, it contributes to particularly corrosive worker management relations. Because, you're getting organized, but your competitor isn't. Whereas in a sectoral system, there wouldn't be this, real opposition to being organized because everybody wouldn't feel at competitive disadvantage.
Exactly. That race to the bottom on wages gets taken off the table, and so you have to compete on all the things we actually want you to compete on, like service quality and innovation and all the things that are actually good for the country and for workers. Yeah, I agree with you.
Hi. Another great publication that American Compass put out with several other organizations, like the Foundation for American Innovation, was the Techno-Industrial Policy Handbook.
Thank you so much for reading that. We were proud of that one, yeah.
Edited by Santi Ruiz, if I remember.
Yeah, we had some editors from each of the organizations, and he was one of them, yeah.
Many
Now
of-
at Anthropic, by the way. He just joined the team at Anthropic.
I didn't know that. I'll have to text him about that. Anyway, sorry. That publication had a lot of great, very innovative and cutting-edge ideas from outside of mainstream sort of DC think tank life. And it was good to put that all together at the forefront. But successful industrial and technology policy will require more than just the issuances of one administration's executive orders. It needs major, probably multiple types of major legislation being successfully put through and signed. But that takes, especially with the current kind of fracturing coalition, as you were saying, half a generational effort maybe at best. And I wonder if the current geostrategic need, I'm thinking of Elbridge Colby's contribution to the New Conservatives, if the current need to try and meet in competition with China requires immediate action that should have been done a decade and a half ago, that will soon outpace us, and then the initial ideas that are being put forward, the conditions will so change. I mean, if it takes so long to successfully do industrial policy in the way that needs to happen, is it actually viable at this point?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I appreciate the dynamic you're articulating. The challenge of both the genius and challenge of the Trump administration is this mentality that, well, we can just do things, and it has this willingness to just take action, and sometimes that's great, and other times it might have done well to be a bit more considered. But the risk, as you point out, is that even if you're willing to take that level of aggressive executive action, that's not a durable solution if the next president sees it differently. And you also point out the problem with legislating on each specific industrial policy question. We did it with chips, but it took years to pass that bill. It was hard. I'm glad we finally did it, but that is not a viable model for every critical industry that we have similar problems for. So our view of this question is that we do need legislation, but we need legislation in the interests of like a standing capacity to do good industrial investment, like a domestic development bank or an industrial finance corporation of the United States, or in the context of some of the executive stuff that this administration has done, a sovereign wealth fund that understands its purpose to be, in part, investment in critical industries. Because the financing deficit is a huge problem, right? We can innovate something here And when it comes time to build it, not only are you going to have other costs associated with that, but a lot of times the private sector just doesn't, that's not the part of it they want to fund. They want you to go and do it elsewhere. And countries, including China, are very good at offering sweet financing deals to industry to do that. So a domestic development, but it's insane to me that we don't have a standing mechanism for public-private investment in critical industries. We have a whole bunch of existing government authorities here and there. One other way to do it would be to kind of bootstrap all of those in a much more coordinated manner. Congressman Ro Khanna and Senator Rubio did a bill on that when Rubio was still in the Senate. But yeah, I think we need to legislate a standing entity that's governed well, is at a little bit of a distance from partisan politics, and can make those kind of investments and fill in that gap. Because when we do that, the research is pretty clear that when you do that, you unlock a whole bunch of other private capital. That kind of front edge risk mitigation from public capital unlocks a whole bunch more private capital. That's industrial policy done right, and we can do it. We just need to do it. And to your last point, I hope that the urgency is apparent to people. A lot of people working on it. Remains to be seen what happens with it. I mean, Senator Coons, a Democrat from Delaware, and then Senator Vance were very close to introducing a bill on this together before Vance left the Senate. And I hope that effort continues with other Republican leadership.
I mean, do you see Europe or New Deal social democracy as models of healthy or like what you call healthy capitalism? Like, do you think there are anything that we can look at and that we should model these future attempts towards a healthier capitalism after, or whether the path forward is a fully maybe a new path that doesn't look like what's been done before or what's being done in Europe?
Well, not to.
Can I ask?
Oh, yeah.
How would you distinguish your approach from just corporatism? The sort of stand.
We're American.
I mean, there were corporatist elements of the New Deal and post sort of New Deal consensus. It's just a follow up on Khan's question.
Yeah. I mean, not to be like biblical about it, but my view is that in a sense, there's nothing new under the sun. What needs to be done is the application of timeless principles to the current context. And we have done that well throughout American history in all kinds of ways. I mean, even just on the question of like industrial investment and tariffs, that is the American system. That is Henry Clay's Americans, starting with Alexander Hamilton, who was like, hey, maybe we should protect nascent domestic industries with trade barriers and also invest in them, through Henry Clay, through Abraham Lincoln. I mean, when Abraham Lincoln said, when he was running for his first public office in Illinois, his platform, he famously issued like a very brief platform. He said, my platform is like the old woman's dance, short and sweet. I want a tariff, I want a national bank, and I want an internal investment system. Thank you. And through the World War II and the post-war era, in which the kind of highly dynamic public-private innovation ecosystem combined with high union density generated immense prosperity and then distributed it much more fairly than our current version of capitalism. Obviously, with the provision, distributed it fairly to those who had legal access to it at the time. But as an economic model, it worked much better than what we're doing now. We've done this successfully a lot in American history, and in some ways, I think it's quite important to recognize that our effort is a reclamation, not an invention. It is a return to a wiser understanding of political economy, as opposed to some totally new. It's the Friedman-esque market fundamentalism that is in fact the historical aberration here, and that needs to be moved past. And again, I mentioned Adam Smith. Even Adam Smith, I think, wasn't quite as doctrinaire on these matters as he gets made out to be. Neither was Reagan. Neither were any of these people. This is aberrant, what we're doing now. So
I'm gonna jump in. I mean, one thing that happens during the post-war sort of New Deal consensus that I think creates public support for a lot of public-private investment was the war against communism. And this was not just uniting the right. I mean, Democrats, especially in the first 2 decades of the Cold War, they were the big Cold Warriors. and Keynes very often complained, famously complained that the only time we seem to be up for public investment and full employment is during war or in the Cold War sense for deterrence. And so I have a very pessimistic view that we're going to need some outside threat or create an outside threat to get the public support or the elite support, whatever. There haven't been that many examples. I think maybe WPA, New Deal, is an important counterexample where we've done sort of massive investment where it hasn't been kind of related to defense or war or an outside enemy.
Or the space race and the Cold
Yeah,
War, right?
exactly.
Yeah. Yes. So on the one hand,
And I just want to add, the Cold War was very scary.
Yes.
It turned out okay for the West. Many, many people died in the proxy wars, but it also could have taken a bad turn. There was a lot of, danger and sort of, and risk that, took place during that period. And yet, it did lead to this sort of public investment
Yes,
and full employment. And so I do worry that it's hard to sustain that without sort of creating some outside threat.
well, Mariana Mazzucato famously did that analysis that like everything that makes the iPhone special and possible has its origin in like a U.S. government program, usually either in NASA or DARPA, which is your point, right? That it's out of that context that we achieved. Yes.
Universities
Yes.
were getting tons of money from DOD. Hundreds of millions.
Yes. Not without the help of the academy, but with its origins in a government program. Yes. And that's certainly true. I think it's fair to say that the reality of our malformed relationship with China has accomplished some of that. Certainly on trade, that is the precipitating force, I think, to bring tariffs back into the conversation. And what is, I think they won't admit it now, but what is in fact a bipartisan recognition that the global trading system needed to be rethought. I think that has everything to do with China. Similarly, with the CHIPS Act, I don't think we get that passed unless it's framed as a response to the China threat, which it was, and it kind of was messaged heavily on the national security, like valence of that work. So I take your point. I think that the China threat has accomplished some of that.
I guess, I would also say, from China's perspective, do we worry, we're reacting to them. We're starting to make ourselves more independent. Do they read that as like we're ready for war? There is a certain...
I hope not.
I know, but there is a certain risk in our, we need to sort of maybe think about how other people read our efforts to become more independent. Do they read that as, oh, they're ready to become more aggressive?
I don't know. I can't remember who famously said, no two countries with a McDonald's have gone to war
I
with
think
each
that's
other.
Thomas Friedman?
Yes,
or-
I think, yeah, right. Which is just, I think, the idea that free trade somehow achieves peace is another feature of this consensus that I think has failed. I think it's wrong. I think it's quite seriously wrong. There's a great speech by the former Minister of Economy, Trade, and Industry in Japan when he was in D.C. a couple years ago called Governing After an Illusion. And his speech is about how we thought that economic interdependence would stabilize the world, and all it did was give bad actors vectors to weaponize that interdependence, which is exactly what China has done. So, to Japan, among other countries like us, especially on something like critical minerals. Like that interdependence is a vulnerability that has been weaponized now. So I think I frame it differently. I think we are already in a bad situation vis-a-vis an adversary because of this interdependence. We have to achieve a higher degree of independence, like as an urgent necessity. And the argument that, well, what if this makes China feel threatened so they do something aggressive in return, I think misreads the situation, which is that they are already doing bad things, using our interdependence on them to do it. That's how I see that. But to your earlier part of your question, I think the progressive movement wanted climate change to play that function, I think, of animating industrial, right, which hasn't worked as a political reality, hasn't worked. I do wonder whether AI might. When we're talking about not just industrial policy, but these broader questions of how to give workers voice and power, how to give them a stake in how to not just unleash American innovation, but give workers a stake in the benefits of that. Like, that is becoming an extremely urgent question in the minds of the public. And it's hugely important to think about that. That might end up rising to the level of allowing some deeper rethinking to continue to happen. Certainly something we're watching, as is, I think, everybody. And something like employee ownership in this context fascinates me. It's like, oh, yes, yeah. Yeah.
We talked so much today about the CHIPS Act, so I did want to just mention that Mike Schmidt, who ran the CHIPS program under Biden, is one of our visiting scholars this year. So we've had several talks from him and other members of that team on their sort of success challenges, thoughts for the future. And you can watch those videos on our site, but we do have an event coming up in DC looking at capital development and industrial policy in the emerging market. And that'll be on April 17th if anybody. It's interesting. Yeah, we'll be moderating, and we have a bunch of other speakers. So I just wanted to share that.